Joining us now is David Tafuri. He served as foreign policy advisor for the Obama campaign and is a former State Department official. David, thank you for being with us. Prime Minister Netanyahu adamantly against a ceasefire. But what impact does the United States, in addition to the growing calls from humanitarian groups, have on really changing that outlook?
Well, I think the U.S. has a lot of influence with Israel right now, and I think we saw that when Israel delayed the ground incursion into Gaza. And I think that was in part because the U.S. urged Israel to wait. I do think, however, that the U.S. is going to support Israel continuing operations in Gaza right now. And the main thing is that Israel feels that they have a lot more work to do to bring the Hamas officers and leaders who were responsible for planning the attack on Israel to justice. And they're making progress on that, they claim. In fact, they killed one of the leaders today. And until they feel like they've captured or killed more of the people responsible for planning those attacks, I don't think they're going to cease or even halt operations. A ceasefire connotes sort of a longer-term deal. I do think there could be some humanitarian pauses in the near future, and my understanding is that Israel has signed on to supporting the U.S. initiative to push for many more trucks of aid and humanitarian supplies to go into Gaza, and a pause could facilitate that. But the pause would be short, and it would have to be done in such a way that it does not obstruct Israel's objective of capturing all of the Hamas people responsible for the attack.
David, you mentioned a ceasefire maybe being something further into this conflict, but a pause perhaps might be possible. But Netanyahu says that a ceasefire would be surrendering to Hamas. So he is just very adamant about not doing it. But how common are ceasefires during war, and what threat would one pose to Israel? Is it the fact that these top commanders perhaps are still there and they've got to get rid of them before they can do anything like that?
That's right. I think that they both have to have captured or killed many of the top commanders, and they also have to feel as if they've sufficiently degraded the military capability of Hamas. And it doesn't sound like Israel feels like they've accomplished that yet. And of course, they're still finding weapons depots in Gaza right now. And so they're still going to pursue Gaza for some more days until they would even consider anything like a ceasefire. But I think a ceasefire is further off. The other complicating factor, of course, is that reportedly there are about 240 hostages still in Gaza. And my guess is that to have a ceasefire, Hamas would have to make a deal to give some or all of those hostages back. And I'm not convinced that Hamas will or wants to do that. In fact, I think Hamas is certainly using those hostages as leverage, and they're not ready to give up that leverage.
Yeah, I believe they said they would release a few more, but that we'll see if that happens. The explosion, though, at the refugee camp in Gaza that just happened today, the images are awful there. The UN concerned that these explosions are now hitting closer to hospitals as well, where a lot of people are taking shelter. So what more should be done to protect innocent lives?
You know, Gaza is a really difficult terrain to conduct operations like this. I spent a week in Gaza several years ago. It's very densely populated. There are a number of different refugee camps. There are a lot of people living below the poverty line there. It's got militants interspersed with civilians. They've got Hamas hiding weapons in refugee camps, in hospitals, in mosques. And so it's extremely difficult. So it's very unfortunate that any civilians have had to be killed. Non-combatants are being killed, and we can only hope that Israel will do everything it can to limit the deaths of non-combatants. Targeting a refugee camp obviously is likely going to result in some deaths of non-combatants, but I assume Israel also had a military target there, and that's why it targeted the refugee camp.
David, do you think at some point we will still see this large-scale ground invasion that has been talked about all along, or do you think we'll continue to see just more of these deliberate and tactical, if you will, operations on the ground?
I think that depends on how things go on the ground. And I also think Israel is not going to forecast what their strategy is. I think they were more than happy to have people in Gaza think there was going to be a large-scale ground offensive, to fear that in order to obey the evacuation order they gave for North Gaza. That doesn't necessarily mean that Israel will ever do it, but if it comes to a point where Israel feels they can only capture the Hamas militants and degrade their military capacity by doing a large-scale ground invasion, then I expect they will do one.
All right, David Tafuri, thank you very much for your time, your expertise. We appreciate